Well, it's going to be a great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I mean, Trav S.D. needs almost no introduction. I actually...
got no intro.
Actually, I had known of Trav and followed him on his blog, which I hope I know of. You guys have been reading Travelanche for a long time. But the first time I actually laid eyes on him was actually physically in the same space, was more than 10 years ago when he came to the New York Distilling Company in Brooklyn, makers of Dorothy Parker Gin, and I was having a book launch for one of my books, and Trav and his big hat came in. And we've been friends ever since, and I'm really happy that he is one of the newest members of the Lambs, too. And when we did the first Marxfest 10 years ago, Trav was on board right away. And he's been a fantastic supporter for all of us, a great counsel, and you guys all know him as a writer and a raconteur, but you're going to get the full Trav experience today. So please welcome Trav S.D.
So we're just waiting on the manicurist and the janitor, and then we can do our reenactment of the stateroom sequence in A Night at the Opera in this room. Thank you. So many to thank. I want to thank the Lambs. I want to thank all the volunteers, all the participants, all of you attendees, our crowdfunders, and especially my long-suffering fellow committee members. Wait, I think they're going to do kind of Vegas kind of thing. Okay, so we did this 10 years ago. I see some familiar faces who came to that one. And, you know, at that one, it was the big challenge was trying to create a talk that would skirt both the experts and, you know, the casual Marx Brothers fan who might just want to, you know, fans of the handful of movies or whatever. Judging by what you paid to be here, you guys are all diehard fans, so that's not going to be too much of a problem. What I will do is, I know that some folks probably won't be at the substantive talks that are happening tomorrow, so I will touch on some things that might strike some of you as Marx Brothers 101, or that you might hear in Noah's talk or Mr. Bader's talk. But I purposely tried to avoid doing too much of that. But, you know, we do cover some of the same time periods, same years, and so forth. I hope this is going to be better than the time I had to talk to a bunch of magicians. All magicians and all magic fans are actual historians. I never met one who wasn't. And most Marx Brothers fans tend to be Marx Brothers historians, too. But there aren't too many Marx Brothers impressionists in the room, so I might be okay. We're gonna. It'll be no surprise to you who listened to the Marx Brothers Council podcast a few weeks ago that the touchstone of the talk is going to be my new book, Marx Brothers Miscellany, or Miscellany. How does Matthew Coniam say it? Miscellany. I refuse to say it that way. Mishigas, the Marx Brothers Mishigas. Why didn't I think of that? Yeah, so this is it. It's a lovely cover by Noah Diamond. I think you'll agree. Folks who showed up yesterday heard Noah's name dropped a lot. You'll hear it dropped a lot throughout my talk. If I could, I would erect a statue to him, but it would probably come out looking like that Lucy statue, which some of you may remember. So, it's not a coincidence this book is published just in time for Marxfest. I got the idea at the 11th hour, worked feverishly to complete it in time for this event, and as a consequence, I'll be the first to admit it regretfully contains a few errors. For example, I was surprised to learn that one of the Marx Brothers was not Lizzo. I heard that name on TV, and she does play a musical instrument, but it turns out she's not one of the Marx Brothers. She's got to be careful with that. Also, another thing, while Chico is the oldest of the Marx Brothers who survived infancy, was born 137 years ago, I've learned that he no longer resides at 720 North Maple Drive in Beverly Hills. little things like that slip by you. I must admit, it's slightly embarrassing when it finds its way to print. I used a lot of metaphors in my intro to this book, which I hope you'll get, to describe the nonlinear, fragmented, harem-scarum format of the book, like cubism and a tossed salad. And I think it all may be a bit clearer when I reveal that it's actually modeled on the Marx Brothers Marxfest ticketing system. Well, it's not really based on the Marxfest ticketing system. That would be crazy. But I regret, I thought of the best metaphor after the book had already gone to print. And my wife is a big Top Chef buff. And there's a concept that gets introduced on that show from time to time by contestants. I'm not a big culinary arts person. But they do something called deconstruction. It's very trendy in the culinary world now, where they sort of pull apart a recipe, and the ingredients are sort of reassembled into different components that add up to a parallel version of the same thing. The same inputs go in, but something different comes out that hopefully will alter or enhance your perspective on the original recipe. To translate that into Marxian terms, it's like if you mixed Frenchie's excellent cooking with his cockamamie tailoring. And there are a lot of books about the Marx Brothers, so I just want to hit it from different angles. It's a collection of essays and adaptations of talks and blog posts that I've written. Hopefully when you digest it all, it'll add up to a three-dimensional portrait of the Marx Brothers. So another thing I wanted to do, I didn't think to put in the book, but this seemed like a good place to do it, and maybe you'll relate a little bit. Something personal. What might have bonded me emotionally, like when I was a kid, to the Marx Brothers. For example, I've always loved and related to the fact that Groucho was an autodidact. He was a bookworm, never went to college, but was so bright and so well-read that he could better than hold his own with a room full of Ivy League wits and prize-winning authors. To a working-class kid, that's really inspirational. Also, believe it or not, the next Marx brother that I relate to is Zeppo. And that's because I have 3 older brothers who are 10 to 20 years older than me, and they suck the oxygen out of the room wherever they are. And so it's tough to keep up with those older brothers, especially when they're hysterical. My brothers are hysterical. I have nothing in common with Chico and Harpo, except I like to look at Thelma Todd and Raquel Torres. But wait, there is a 5th Marx brother, the elusive, mysterious, frustratingly unrecorded Gummo. And before I go there, though, I want to spend a little time talking about a much broader topic, a topic I was largely drawn to because of my fandom of the Marx Brothers. And the connection between Vaudeville and Gummo is because of the 5 brothers. Gummo is kind of the Vaudeville brother par excellence. He's kind of trapped in amber in Vaudeville for all time, because he wasn't on Broadway, wasn't in the movies, didn't do radio, didn't even sit down for a TV interview that I know of, even for like a kick in later years, like some Marx Brother wives and kids did at various times. There aren't even really many photos as compared with his brothers. In fact, yes, at the Tef Teller program yesterday, I was really hoping for some Gummo audio, but it's got to be scarcer than scarce, I'm sure. So we move on to Vaudeville and this other book. This talk is full of commercial interruptions, but they're not all for my own products. But folks who were lucky enough to hear Adam Gopnik yesterday, he played a large role in my being able to write this book. For those who are attending the Herring Barrel review that we're doing tonight, or say Johnny Pork Pie's burlesque show out at Coney, I produced a lot of variety shows like that back in the day, in addition to being a journalist and a writer. And Adam Gopnik got in touch with me, and I wound up in a story he wrote about the revival of burlesque about 20 years ago. And, an editor at FSG saw that and knew that, and also saw my byline in some magazines and asked me if I had a book. And I have like 100 books waiting under my carpet, ready to go. So I did, and that's how that came about. So ultimately, Adam Gopnik is to thank for my having written No Applause. Which if you don't know, it's a history of, kind of a fun history of vaudeville. So vaudeville has many definitions. For one thing, it's just merely a style of performance, but broadly speaking, it can refer to light entertainment or variety entertainment. In America, it's usually used with reference to a very specific nationwide industry that many have defined as lasting from about 1882 to 1932. Over time, I've begun to realize that prior to that, you might want to include a kind of proto-vaudeville that started in the 1860s or 1870s, and a kind of post-vaudeville that went as late as like the 1950s. And then if you include TV variety of the good kind, of the Ed Sullivan kind, you can get it up to like 1970 or 1971, kind of a century of vaudeville. And if I had it to do again, which I hope I will, then I'll kind of rewrite it to go that way. But after the Ed Sullivan show went off the air, the variety shows that followed, I would not think of as vaudeville so much. So there was this 50-year stretch where all cities, large and small, throughout America had these theaters. They were ultimately sort of bought up and run by these chains, and entertainers would have to go around the country, usually by train, from theater to theater physically to perform. And the Marx Brothers came right along, right at the sweet spot of the peak of vaudeville. If you measure the Marx Brothers movie career as ending with The Big Store, which I know is a bit draconian, but prior to the comebacks, when it was their main movie career, their vaudeville career was longer than their movie career. They started out as a charming but probably pretty lousy singing act as boys, and they started horsing around, and then largely with the help of their uncle Al Sheen, of the team of Gallagher and Sheen, they worked out sketches, spiced up with improv, finally working their way up to Broadway revues and book shows. Marx Brothers are basically third-generation vaudevillians. Their grandparents, their maternal grandparents, didn't perform in American vaudeville, but they were variety artists back in the old country. And so the grandfather was a magician and a ventriloquist, and the grandmother played the harp. That much you should know. That's Marx Brothers 101. Hope you know. So their influence on the family is obvious. Influence of the family on the brothers is obvious. What I wanted to do is take some brief looks at other people, other performers in vaudeville who were influences on the Marx Brothers, and also to provide a little bit of context for what they did. We're accustomed, as movie fans, there's kind of no one like them in the movies, kind of arguable couple of other comedy acts. In vaudeville, it was a little bit different. They weren't quite so unusual. They were definitely the funniest act in vaudeville, and the most spontaneous act in vaudeville. But some of the aspects that we think of being, making them, sort of rare birds or whatever, a little less unique. So this is the first. This is Weber and Fields. I think of them as the granddaddy of all comedy, American comedy teams. They came out of the Lower East Side back when the scene was dominated by saloons and mostly dominated by the Irish. It was a time when anyone ever heard of Harrigan and Hart? They were the biggest Irish acts back then. The Irish ethnic material, they did like, the Irish acts would be what we would think of as horrible stereotypes about the Irish. It's about drunkenness and beating each other up, and the audiences loved it. Unfortunately, blackface was part of their comic arsenal, and comic drag was very big. And then the main group to talk about here, though, is Germans, believe it or not. And the first big wave of American immigration in the middle 19th century were Irish and German. And they were about kind of neck and neck in numbers, maybe slightly bigger for the Irish. So comedians would work it was called Dutch, but not meaning Dutch as in the Netherlands. They called it more like Deutschland. So they called these German acts Dutch. And so the comedians would work that in also with the other ethnic specialties, dude, Irish, blackface, Dutch, and what was called Hebrew, politely or insultingly, depending on your point of view, and that's the Jewish stereotype. Weber and Fields were Polish Jews, and part of a first wave of Jewish immigration, and they lived in Klein-Deutschland, the Lower East Side, which was the German neighborhood back then. They had a German neighborhood just like this Little Italy and Chinatown today. And they started out doing all of those ethnic stereotypes, but what they really scored with was these comical German characters, Mike and Meyer. There are aspects of, say, the Three Stooges act that owes their existence to the way Mike and Meyer would beat each other over the heads and so forth. They became the most popular comedy team in vaudeville, so much so that they ended up producing their own national tours of a vaudeville review, and then had 4 of those road shows touring the country simultaneously. And then they built a Broadway theater intended only to show or showcase their own productions. So that's huge. It's unimaginably huge by today's standards, without including, media. So to all vaudeville comedians, these guys are like the granddaddies. One reason that they're not well known today is that they were long in the tooth by the time movies came along. They started out in the 1870s, so by like the 1930s, they were pretty elderly old dudes. But here's where you have another plug. Archaeophone Records put this out. I wrote the liner notes, so I wanted to plug this. If you get it, then you can hear these routines that are not unlike Marx Brothers routines, and some of them date to like the 1880s. You get to hear the real guys do them. I contend that they hold up, that they're really funny still. Without Weber and Fields, you don't get Gallagher and Sheen or the Marx Brothers, I don't think. As you may recall, or most of you may know, in the early days, Groucho played a German character, what was called a Dutch character. Harpo played an Irishman. Chico played the Italian, like he always did, kind of a one-note Johnny. And Gummo played the Hebrew. And then over the time, they found their voices, except Harpo lost his voice. Chico never changed, and Gummo retired. Never mind. Real vaudeville comedy buffs will recognize the 2 guys in the northwest corner of this photo. That's Joe Smith and Charlie Dale, the team of Smith and Dale. Hilarious sketch comedians, still doing their stuff on the Ed Sullivan Show into the 1960s. Partial inspiration, I believe, for Neil Simon's The Sunshine Boys. I chose this photo because Smith and Dale had splintered off from this quartet, which was called the Avon Comedy Four. Around the turn of the last century, the 1890s and the early aughts, there was a real vogue for these comedy quartets in vaudeville and on audio recordings. Al Sheen had been in one called the Manhattan Comedy Four. And while there were tons of these groups, it was a short-lived trend, but an important one. They sang in 4-part harmony, concept that was later borrowed for nostalgic purposes in barbershop quartets. And so they'd sing songs, and then in between they'd have their funny patter, maybe monologues. One would stand out front and do a monologue, and they'd cut up. The early Beatles, very early Beatles, before they got sort of drugged and psychedelic, remind me a lot of the energy of these comedy fours. Or if you ever go and you see like a small improv unit, squad, like 4 improv comedians, very similar. So I contend, I haven't really come across this, I haven't found it confirmed or anything, but it seems to me likely that there's some memory of the comedy four concept in the Marx Brothers act. Certainly, when you see them like out of makeup and out of costume, and it's just the 4 of them, 4 dashing showbiz dudes, it kind of looks like those comedy fours used to look. And then of course, they open Monkey Business by singing Sweet Adeline, which is the big barbershop quartet tune. Those of you who attend the Herring Barrel Review may hear a fractured version of that. And they may also hear a fractured version of this. So I almost didn't spotlight them here, just on the assumption that Gallagher and Sheen is too basic a topic for this crowd. But in the end, happen to know that some folks here are outside of this cult. So I'm just going to run it down really quickly. The Marx Brothers' uncle Al Sheen was teamed up with a guy named Ed Gallagher in vaudeville, and they were best known for performing what I think of as the most popular song in vaudeville. Though you could probably argue about that all day, what that was. But the tune and the concepts of the song are so catchy, many people have appropriated it over the decades. And then this Egyptian theme, that was just because it was a fad at the time. If you're Agatha Christie fans, you know that Egyptology was all the rage in the 20s. So I think also of Gallagher and Sheen as inspiring the more contentious aspects of the Sunshine Boys. The bit with them arguing and stuff, that wasn't Smith and Dale at all. Those guys were, in fact, they're buried next to each other. They were such good friends. Gallagher and Sheen didn't even talk to each other when they weren't performing. Did not like each other at all. Uncle Al, of course, inspired the boys, Groucho first, to go into vaudeville. And so he did. This is Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards was vaudeville's preeminent purveyor of kiddie acts in vaudeville. You may know he was one of Groucho's first employers in showbiz. So this, I believe that's Groucho up top. Can correct me if I'm wrong. Sure looks like him to me. Dozens of future stars came through Gus Edwards' mill. People like Georgie Jessel, Eddie Cantor, who we just saw parodied in one of those cartoons, Phil Silvers, Walter Winchell, Ray Bolger, Eleanor Powell, Burt Wheeler, the Duncan sisters. He was especially known, Gus Edwards, as a Tin Pan Alley songwriter, and probably his best known song, even today, is a song called School Days. And from that evolved a sketch with all of these kids that took place in a schoolroom. There were a million copycats of that school act. And the Marx Brothers, it could be argued, were among them, just because it was a popular kind of act. The scene in the biology class in Horsefellers is descended from their version of the school act. In 1908, Gus Edwards had a Broadway show called School Days, and it was staged by this gentleman, Ned Wayburn. Ned Wayburn was a former vaudeville performer himself, became a powerful producer, director, and choreographer for Broadway. He also owned and ran Ned Wayburn's College of Vaudeville, which Groucho and Gummo attended as boys, learning such skills as they possessed. Mr. Bader here. I feel like I learned from his book that he also co-produced their act at one point, or an early version of, say, the Three Nightingales. So, Harpo, Groucho, Gummo, when they're a trio. So, appreciation for Gummo, because I always support the underdog and take the road less traveled by. Gummo's real name was Milton. The Marx Brothers' parents gave the most embarrassing names. Zeppo's is Herbert. So Gummo's real name is Milton. He's the youngest of the original four and the first to join in an act with Groucho. He was a member of the act from 1907 to 1918, which is 11 years. Harpo joined not long after Gummo, and then Chico didn't join until 1912, so they had a few years as a trio. At the time, Chico was in duos with other comedy partners, already doing the Italian specialty. So Gummo was the brother, obviously, that the much younger Zeppo replaced, and he left the act to serve in World War I and retired to pursue other pursuits after. Of the five, he was the least outgoing, yet apparently he wasn't like bookish like Groucho, maybe not as witty in conversation as Groucho. But that doesn't mean that there's a void there. He was probably funnier than most people who aren't Marx Brothers. When they're all doing ethnic specialties, he played the Hebrew, which is probably the easiest comedy assignment for a Jewish kid, right? And then he evolved to be the straight one, the juvenile. And it may be a question of style, but he seems to be the most conventionally handsome of the four, maybe of the five. Groucho wasn't bad looking, but he had a lazy eye. And the two oldest brothers had good faces for clowns. But when Gummo was young, he waxed stout when he was older. He probably got to be the pudgiest of the five. He could pull off the romantic lead. And best of all, like Groucho, he had studied at Ned Wayburn's Vaudeville School. So he had a top-notch vaudeville skill. He could dance at a professional level, hence his nickname. Gummo, he got his nickname, Groucho got his because of what was called a grouch bag, where you kept your money, and he liked to keep his money tight, and it had been stolen from him on occasion, so he became known as Groucho. And Chico because he liked the chicks, and Harpo because he played the harp. Gummo was because he wore these gum-soled dancing shoes. Zeppo, that's a mystery. No one knows why he's called that. There are 4 or 5 theories. Dancing, ability to dance, as you know, is an important vaudeville skill. I mean, Bob Hope could dance. You kind of had to know to dance, and that was his specialty. And it was about as useful, I should think, as Harpo and Chico's musical interludes in the act. It's a skill that would have been very useful in their semi-musical movies of the 1930s. Zeppo couldn't do that. If you're wondering how it might have worked, what it might have looked like in a Marx Brothers movie, I would refer you to the comedies of Wheeler and Woolsey. Any Wheeler and Woolsey fans here? Yeah. All right. Even a small fraction of this audience. But Burt Wheeler in that pairing and in the movies kind of plays a parody of the juvenile, and he will dance and do musical numbers. So I picture if Gummo had been in movies, maybe he might have gotten little interludes like that. To sort of cement that comparison, Kalma and Ruby also wrote scripts for Wheeler and Woolsey. So I don't have a slide for Burt Wheeler. However, Burt Wheeler was a lamb. So you will find some pictures of him hither and yon on the walls here in different places, hopefully not in the restroom. As we talked about in the Marx Brothers Council podcast, Gummo was a founding member of the act. He was there before Harpo and Chico. And in the same generation as the brothers. In other words, I picture him as one of a quartet, one of 4. And when Zeppo's in the act, the dynamic is more like 3 plus 1. There's like a huge disparity in status that I don't think Gummo had. So I suspect that the dynamic would have been much better, less perplexing. Zeppo was kind of like an appendix in the act. We all know that he was very funny, off screen, but in the act he was kind of like an appendix. So a lot of people ask about Zeppo, like why is he even there? And I think with Gummo, the question would have been, when's Gummo going to dance in this act, or do his bit, whatever his bit was. You certainly had no question about why he was there. But he was a little shy, sometimes stuttered, flubbed his lines, and was self-conscious about that. And the line flubbing had also been a problem for Harpo. And Harpo just dealt with it by clamming up. But you kind of can't have 2 Harpos in the act. Or I suppose you could, it would be kind of weird. And, if Groucho or Chico flubbed the line, they didn't care. They just shrugged it off because they had a lot of chutzpah that way. So, but Gummo had stage fright. He was only too glad to bail when he found that exit ramp known as World War I. But I bet money that the audience at the time thought of him as one of the funny, crazy Marx Brothers that they saw at the Vaudeville theater, the good-looking one, the one who dances. They would not have like singled him out to be like the inferior Marx Brother. So if he could have brazened it out like his brothers, probably would have been fine, but we'll never know. Makes me crazy. So here, just a couple other pictures. You'll probably get lots more of that tomorrow. But Gummo, the revolving, that's Groucho before he was doing a Groucho character. And that's Gummo there with the wild pomp, right? They were all rocking those pomps at one certain point. There's just like, I don't know how they kept it up with soap or what. That's with their Uncle Julius, and Gummo's on the left, Groucho top, Harpo right. And this hangs in my office. I love this picture. That's them. You know, he doesn't look shyer than the other three, right? Even Groucho's looking very serious in this picture. So okay, now we move on. Great. Okay. So one reason I was involved with Noah's production of I'll Say She Is I just, like many of you, just kind of go crazy picturing those aspects of the Marx Brothers that we don't get to see in movies, and just kind of really want to make it happen somehow, even if we have to do it ourselves. So now we're going to talk a bit about the little-known Marx Brothers' first movie, made in 1921, which was a silent picture called Humor-Risk. Humor-Risk. And that's the announcement from the newspaper. So by the 20s, Marx Brothers just kind of felt like they were beating their head against the ceiling in vaudeville, and it was kind of going nowhere. They're getting fairly long in the tooth and just really chomping at the bit to like hit the next level. And so, reflecting on the success of Charlie Chaplin, who they actually knew, they met in 1913, circa 1913, just before he went out to work for Max Sennett at Keystone. They were in the Pacific Northwest. One was working the Pantages circuit, the other was working the Sullivan and Considine circuit, I can't remember which. They were competing circuits in the Pacific Northwest, and they went to see Chaplin and reported him as being one of the funniest things they'd ever seen in their lives, which it caused me to sort of scratch my head for years. It's taken me years to kind of figure out, because their styles of comedy are so different, but this will give an opportunity to talk about where there's actually some kind of overlap between them. The movie Humorist was written by Joe Swirling, who many of you know as the writer of Guys and Dolls, but he had written an earlier tab musical called Street Cinderella. And the title was a spoof on Humoresque, which was a huge hit at the cinema the previous year, directed by Frank Borsage. And this is where the Marx Brothers overlap with the content of my previous book, Chained of Fools. So so this is where silent comedy and the Marx Brothers kind of come together. Around the time, this was just before Marxfest when this book came out, back in 2014 was when Marxfest was. And I was doing a lot of fooling around with video and sort of doing some faux silent comedy movies and so forth. So, yes. My wife is in one of them and she's shaking her head. Okay, don't want to embarrass her. So some of you got, because for an April Fool's prank, I put out that we had found Humoresque, and I'm the guilty party behind that. So for this time out, for this year's Marxfest, I toyed with the idea of creating what the Humoresque movie might look like for real, for like gaffing like a 10 or 20 minute, faux two-reeler for an April Fool's prank. I don't know if I'll end up, I'm still probably, hopefully, going to make this movie, but I got bogged down with writing the book that we're talking about and helping to produce Marxfest and stuff. It would have been crazy to try and do that at that time. So you'll just be in on it with me if I manage to release it on a subsequent April Fool's Day. But also to kind of save the phenomenon as Ptolemy used to put it. I put the scenario in the book, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit. What my idea for a scenario, because the actual scenario does not exist. What this is going to be is like some very well-informed fan art, maybe, or a thought experiment about it. Because the original was apparently terrible and subsequently destroyed or lost or something. So what I'm about to do would kind of fit into our next program, which is the Animal Cracker Salon. This is less fact than fantasy, I guess. As we did with I'll Say She Is in 2014, my approach was similar, where I took all the clues I could bundle together and sort of extrapolate on them to try and get at what the character of it might look like, a pseudo-humoresque. For example, we know that a guy named Dick Smith was the director of that movie, and many of his films survive, and I've seen a bunch of them thanks to my good friends at Undercrank Productions. Watched many of Smith's movies starring his wife Alice Howell, who's known as the female Chaplin by a lot of people. So there you go. You can own one of these for your very own Undercrank's Alice Howell DVD. So she's cute and hilarious, and even though it's a digression, I want to give you a quick glimpse into the visual style of this husband and wife team. Here they both are. She's a very trusting wife, as you see. So they were in Vaudeville together, and he was initially an actor as well, and they acted in movies for Max Sennett. Then they went out on their own with him directing her in the comedies. Howell's trademark was this rat's nest hair. And you can get a glimpse of Dick Smith's visual style from some of these shots we're going to show. So that's her. She bears an uncanny resemblance to this lady, I feel, with her rat's nest hair. This is Minnie Marx, the Marx Brothers' mother. Maybe a little Harpo influence, right, or influence on Harpo. That's just a coincidence, though. But I like the way that Alice Howell was on the phone, and he was also on the phone without a dog. I saw so many like pictures I found hilarious. Well, just like Daryl threw these pictures of Alice Howell, some plugs for her. And I think there's maybe one more. Yeah. Okay. Of course, she wasn't in Humoresque. The Marx Brothers were, and we know a little something about their characters because they kind of testified to this in later years. So, Harpo was kind of the star, not surprisingly, and he was named Watson and played a detective. I picture him in my version, in a deerstalker hat like the one he wears in Duck Soup when he comes in with all of the dogs to investigate as a spy. Oops, oh, there she is again. There's no losing Alice Howell. I like the garlic, the telegraphing of the garlic. So this kind of idea, maybe. Groucho was the villain. And I find this easy to imagine as well, believe it or not, Groucho in a silent movie. He often quotes melodrama cliches, like physical business in comedies, sort of shaking his fist and pulling off his coat to, when he takes umbrage at something. He's always doing that kind of stuff, sort of pretending he's going to fight or duel. Picture him in a top hat, because villains wear top hats. In a top hat, he reminds me of Billy DeWolf's character, Professor Hinkle in Frosty the Snowman. Quite a bit. I think maybe when I first saw Groucho, obviously I saw Frosty before I saw the Marx Brothers. Probably thought of this. And then, this is important, this is before Chaplin discovered or settled on his tramp character in the Derby. He played other characters, and sometimes he would do a melodrama villain kind of thing. We've got a couple more of this with him in that look. And so that kind of idea can be drawn from. And also this guy, next guy, Ford Sterling. Ford Sterling is the comedian whom Chaplin replaced at Keystone
when he was hired. A very funny comedian, and his shtick was also German shtick or Dutch shtick, just as Groucho had done in Vaudeville, just a popular specialty back then. So, as a sidebar, I've actually seen Groucho in a silent movie. It's a home movie he made with his family shortly after moving to Hollywood, and he's out of makeup and he's kind of fooling around with his family, pretending to leave for work. And he does something that seems uncharacteristic to me, but is relevant here. He's about to leave, he comically trips. And we don't think of that kind of slapstick as being characteristic of any of the Marx Brothers. They tended not to be physical in that way. In that humoresque ad we opened with, it said specifically, they advertised comedy without custard. They probably just thought that that kind of silent comedy shtick was just old hat. And, we know that they were not very nice to Buster Keaton when he was a gag man for the MGM movies. So seeing Groucho do that for his kids in that movie, it made me feel almost like I was watching the real Julius, just being a dad. That's what a dad does, to fool around for his kids. But the question is, would he have gone there in a silent movie? We know that he admired Chaplin a great deal. And actually, Chaplin and Groucho kind of share some physical vocabulary, if you think about it. That same stuff I was talking about, with the fist shaking and pulling jackets off for fights and stuff. It's very specific language that they're taking from the stage. As for Chico in the movie, he plays Columbus's friend. No, that's the story of mankind. He plays an Italian, of course, and I'm afraid I'm going to get a little politically correct here, and I don't recall Chico ever doing this, and it's kind of like the thing you would think he would do is very politically incorrect, and I'm going to apologize to every Italian here. But you can go there, Jen, yeah. The idea of the organ grinder and his monkey, and I don't know who those girls are on his organ grinder. Anyway, this is, for whatever reason, I can't even think why this became a stereotype thing. It almost has come to be regarded as heinously as blackface, or it was back in the day. Maybe it's become so obscure that folks don't even know about it anymore, and the new stereotype is like Goodfellas or something. But the reason I do this is not because I want a stereotype, it's because the monkey makes sense in the movie, and that's what this is about. Monkeys are present in many Larry Seaman comedies. What's that, you say? Larry Seaman, and that is his correct name, and that is how to say it, was a peer of Harold Lloyd and Charlie Chaplin in the late teens. There were some years where he came very close to being the most popular silent comedian in the country. There are many reasons why I would draw from him for inspiration for gags for doing something like this. He's Jewish at a time that was kind of rare in the field, and he's got those kind of instincts. He's descended from a magician, like the Marx Brothers are, and has that kind of a mind for surreal gags. If you attended Adam Gopnik's talk yesterday about the difference between old comedy and new comedy, like the Marx Brothers, Larry Seaman is about old comedy. It's about gags, whether they're rooted in plot or story or character or not. He just piles on crazy gags. It becomes an interesting question, like if he had done talkies, would they have been like the Marx Brothers movies, So you can find his movies on YouTube, but there are lots of gags that one finds Marxian. But in nearly every Larry Seaman movie, or lots of them, he repeated, like the Three Stooges, he repeated gags from movie to movie. So one thing that commonly happens in his movies are monkeys run amok. And that's his leading lady there, Lucille Carlyle, with a monkey, just to prove it. Anyway, I picture his part in this movie being something like the peanut vendor in Duck Soup, or something along those lines, or the tout and Stooley. He had a dog in Duck Soup, so one thinks of pets as going with Harpo, but he could have a monkey in this one. The idea for a plot for this movie I took from the original Humorisk on the assumption that they would be parodying the actual movie. And it's a melodrama, and it's got to do with a violinist and poverty and wanting to win a girl and stuff. So the idea for this is that Zeppo will play the young violinist, and his rival would be Groucho, and there'd be a Dumont-esque mother who prefers Groucho because he has money. And they vie for the ingenue's attentions, just as they do with the college widow in Horse Feathers. Zeppo's spooning with a girl in a park. This is also very conventional silent movie kind of plot. Spooning on a park bench, Groucho steals the expensive Stradivarius type violin. Zeppo hires Harpo to retrieve the violin as the detective, and then he has to come down a coal chute at some point, because that's the one thing we know about Humorisk, is that Harpo made his entrance sliding down a coal chute. And then at some point, I think it would make a great deal of sense, even though it's already in duck soup, to revive the mirror routine, which was kind of an old comedy routine that predates the Marx Brothers' involvement in doing it in Duck Soup. This is Max Linder, who was France's greatest silent comedian. The same year that Humorisk came out, he did this, the mirror scene, in his movie 7 Years Bad Luck. So in the last act, I picture Zeppo's the buff one, and in my defense of Zeppo, I kind of want a lot of their movies to end with fisticuffs, with like at the end of Monkey Business. It just works perfectly. They use him there. So like something like that would happen, and maybe he goes in disguise and drag. Like this is Wallace Beery's first silent comedy character, Sweetie, and he actually played a girl in his early SNA comedies, the same studio Chaplin worked for, Sweetie. So you could do that. So as opposed to my talk, this would be short, 10 to 20 minutes long, maybe. Chico's ragtime style music could be the soundtrack, and we'd shoot mostly in the enclave of Great Neck, New York. And there's a reason for that. Groucho and Chico lived there for several years during their Broadway years, and Harpo lived there for one summer, and the folks lived in neighboring Little Neck for a while. And so this leads up to what I hope will be the greatest treat of the talk. And this is has to do with the Broadway year, so I thought I'd plug this book, which you probably already own, but what we're about to see is basically the Groucho's digs when I'll say she is in coconuts and animal crackers were happening. In the teens and 20s, like the old George M. Cohan song, 45 Minutes from Broadway, for a while Cohan lived in Great Neck during the teens and 20s. Kind of everybody lived there. It was kind of like what we now think of as Beverly Hills. Ed Wynn, Fanny Brice, W.C. Fields, Eddie Cantor, Robert Woolsey, Lou Fields, Oscar Hammerstein, Ring Lardner, Maurice Chevalier, on and on and on. And even Oscar Shaw. Any Oscar Shaw fans? He's the stiff in the coconut. That's right. One of the 6 or 7 stiffs in the coconut.
It was a lamb.
Oh, and he was a lamb. I take it back. Okay, so about a year ago, Noah Diamond sent out an alert that there's going to be an open house at Groucho's old place, an estate sale. So I laced up my sneakers and I ran over and I pretended I was interested in buying knickknacks. It should be stressed that Groucho moved out of the house when he went west permanently just prior to making Monkey Business. So none of Groucho's stuff was in that sale, that's going back 90 years or whatever. But a lot of the house itself and the fixtures and so forth looked kind of vintage to me. So I think a lot of what we'll see may have been what the what it looked like when he was there. Groucho and the family, according to Arthur Marx's memoir, lived in his house from 1926 to 1931. This is what the well-dressed nosy Parker wears at a knick-knack sale. And the hat is courtesy of the good people SUNY Fredonia, who put on the wonderful Fredonia Marxonia event every year on Groucho's birthday. So I'll take you through this a little bit. There's the better shot of Groucho's house. The plaque by the Great Neck Historical Society. Here's the living room, where I imagine lots of fabulous people entertaining. I imagine quips in this dining room. It's always been the dining room, probably not the original table. The kitchen, I especially love this little strange little cupboard thing that's over like a pantry thing in this room, and the next shot gets a little closer. I picture like kids fooling around in that, maybe Harpo fooling around in that, you know. This is the bedroom, and I'm sorry, I'm front and center, but I was so excited because I pictured this as being maybe what Groucho was thinking of. You know, this is where Groucho rested his head when he wrote his humor book, Beds, which came out in 1930 when he was still living there. So, I don't know, I was in awe to be walking around this house. That's the other side of the bedroom. So as you can see, he's got this is kind of a large, we don't say master bedroom anymore, I guess main bedroom. Place to hang out on the sofa or read books or whatever. And this is where I picture young Arthur and Miriam playing when they're children. This is a playroom in the attic. Lots of room in the landscaped backyard for kids to play. And they were quite little at this time, little breakfast patio. I don't know if that was historically there, but all right, back to this. So you're supposed to end a talk with a call to action. What the hell can my call to action be? But believe it or not, I thought of something. Looking around this room, I see one person who's under 30 years old, and he's a Marx Brothers fan because I warped his mind when he was a toddler. So my mission for you all is to find ways to talk to young people, because they're increasingly resistant to vintage entertainment of the kind we like. A lot of us appreciate the complexities. I think it's better to work on trying to articulate the complexities as complexities rather than digging in and fighting them on it, because if you don't, the Marx Brothers may soon be as dead as Larry Seaman. And I speak on college campuses. Kids don't know who they are. So talk to young people. That's my talk.